Hey there, tonight we step into the streets of ancient Rome to explore a topic rarely discussed with historical honesty. The lives of women who worked in what historians call the oldest profession weren't what popular culture often portrays. Behind the romanticised myths and simplified narratives existed real people navigating complex social structures, economic realities, and daily challenges that shaped their existence in profound ways. Before settling in, take a moment to like this exploration if the topic interests you, and perhaps share in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's always wonderful to connect with fellow history enthusiasts who appreciate honest historical inquiry. Now, get comfortable, and let's journey together through the lesser-known corners of Roman social history. When thinking about ancient Rome, minds often drift toward emperors and gladiators, marble temples and military conquests. But beneath these grand narratives, millions of ordinary people lived, worked, and navigated the realities of daily existence. Among them were women who entered a profession that Roman society simultaneously depended upon and looked down upon, a paradox that shaped every aspect of their lives. Roman society, for all its sophistication in law, engineering, and governance, maintained complex attitudes toward intimate commerce. The profession was legal, regulated, and in some ways accepted as necessary. Yet those who worked in it occupied the lowest rungs of the social hierarchy, facing stigma and restrictions that marked them as fundamentally different from respectable citizens. Understanding their daily lives requires setting aside modern judgments and examining the historical reality with clear eyes. These were women navigating limited options in a world that offered few paths for female independence. Some entered the profession through economic necessity, others through circumstances beyond their control, and a few through what might be considered choice within their constrained options. Tonight's exploration examines not the sensational aspects that popular culture emphasises, but the mundane realities, how these women lived day to day, how they navigated legal systems, how they managed their work and personal lives, and how they fit into the broader tapestry of Roman urban existence. This is social history, examining lives rarely documented with the care accorded to emperors and senators, but no less real for their absence from grand historical narratives. So let's begin where any historical inquiry must start, with understanding the social and legal framework that shaped these women's existences in the ancient Roman world. Roman law, remarkably sophisticated for its time, addressed the profession of intimate commerce with surprising detail. Understanding the legal framework provides essential context for comprehending the daily realities these women faced. The practice itself was legal throughout most of Roman history. Unlike some societies that banned such commerce entirely, Rome regulated it through taxation and registration systems. Women working in this capacity were required to register with local authorities, a process that made their profession officially recognised but also permanently marked their social status. Registration, called professio, involved appearing before officials and declaring one's intention to work in the profession. This official act had profound consequences. Once registered, a woman lost many legal rights and social privileges. She couldn't marry citizens of certain classes, her testimony in court carried less weight, and she was subject to specific regulations regarding dress and behaviour in public. The toga, normally a male garment, became legally required dress for registered women in this profession. This clothing requirement served as visual marker, ensuring that respectable women wearing the traditional stola wouldn't be confused with those working in intimate commerce. This dress code, enforced by law, meant that anyone seeing these women in public immediately understood their profession. Legal disabilities extended beyond dress codes. These women couldn't inherit property under certain circumstances, faced restrictions on where they could live, and were excluded from religious ceremonies open to respectable matrons. The law created a separate category of citizenship for them, legally Roman but practically excluded from many aspects of civic life. Taxation of the profession provided significant revenue to the state. Women working independently paid taxes directly to authorities. Those working in establishments paid through the owners of those establishments. These taxes, recorded in official documents, provide modern historians with glimpses into the profession's economic scale, though exact numbers remain debated. The legal distinction between women forced into the profession and those who entered voluntarily existed in Roman law, but proved difficult to establish in practice. women sold into servitude, those enslaved through debt or capture, and those who registered officially all worked under different legal frameworks, though daily realities might differ little. Penalties for operating without registration existed, but enforcement varied. Authorities in large cities like Rome attempted systematic regulation. In smaller towns and rural areas, enforcement was looser and informal arrangements more common. This geographic variation meant that experiences differed significantly based on location. The legal age for entering the profession, like many aspects of Roman law, evolved over time. During the Republic, no clear minimum age existed. Imperial legislation attempted to establish minimums, with varying degrees of success. Enforcement of age restrictions proved challenging, particularly regarding enslaved individuals who had no legal control over their own work. The relationship between the profession and Roman moral legislation created paradoxes. Augustus's moral reforms, designed to encourage marriage and childbearing among the upper classes, actually exempted registered workers from penalties against unmarried women. This legal carve-out acknowledged that the profession existed outside normal social structures. Protection under law remained minimal. While extreme violence could theoretically be prosecuted, practical recourse for women in the profession was limited. Their testimony held less weight, their complaints received less serious attention, and their social position made legal vindication difficult even when technically possible. The legal framework also addressed establishments where this commerce occurred. Owners of such establishments, often called line if female or lino if male, faced their own regulations and taxes. These individuals, while profiting from the profession, shared some of the social stigma attached to those they employed. Manumission, the freeing of enslaved persons, offered one path out of the profession for those held in servitude. However, former slaves remained bound to their former owners through patronage relationships that could continue to involve them in the profession even after formal freedom. True independence remained elusive for many. Religious dimensions added further complexity. While excluded from certain religious rites, women in the profession weren't completely barred from religious participation. Some deities, particularly those associated with love and fertility, maintained connections to the profession. This religious tolerance contrasted with social condemnation, creating another paradox in Roman attitudes. The legal treatment of children born to women in the profession varied based on the mother's status. Children of free women in the profession were technically free, but inherited much of their mother's social stigma. Children born to enslaved workers were themselves enslaved, perpetuating cycles across generations. Geographic restrictions attempted to separate the profession from respectable areas. Laws prohibited certain activities near temples, schools, and respectable residential areas. These zones of exclusion pushed the profession into specific neighbourhoods, creating districts that became associated with this commerce. The legal framework, for all its complexity, ultimately reflected Roman pragmatism. Rather than attempting to eliminate a practice they considered inevitable, Roman authorities regulated it, taxed it, and attempted to contain its social implications. This approach created a legal structure that acknowledged reality while maintaining social hierarchies that placed these women at society's margins. The physical spaces where women in this profession worked varied enormously, from elaborate establishments catering to wealthy clients to simple rooms in crowded insulae. The multi-storey apartment buildings that housed Rome's poor. The most basic arrangements involved independent workers operating from rented rooms. These spaces, typically small single rooms in lower-class neighbourhoods, served as both living quarters and workspaces. The rooms contained minimal furnishings, a bed, perhaps a small table, some storage for belongings. Decoration ranged from non-existent to modest attempts at creating welcoming atmosphere through wall paintings or oil lamps. Larger establishments, sometimes called lupanaria, provided more structured environments. These buildings, purpose-built or adapted, contained multiple small rooms opening onto corridors. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii preserves examples of such structures, showing stone bed platforms, small wall paintings, and practical layouts designed for efficient use of urban space. The establishments in Pompeii, preserved by volcanic ash, reveal details about working environments. Small rooms, barely larger than the bed platforms they contained, opened directly onto streets or internal corridors. Stone platforms with raised edges served as beds. Wall paintings, ranging from simple to elaborate, decorated many rooms. Some included price lists or names scratched into plaster by previous occupants. Daily routines began later than for most Roman workers. The profession operated primarily in afternoons and evenings, when potential clients finished daytime occupations and sought entertainment or companionship. Mornings were typically for rest, particularly for those who worked late into nights. Personal maintenance consumed significant portions of mornings and early afternoons. Roman culture valued cleanliness, and those in the profession needed to maintain appearances that attracted clients. This meant regular bathing, which involved visits to public baths when private facilities weren't available. Hair care, skincare with oils and cosmetics, and attention to clothing all required time and resources. The public baths presented both opportunities and challenges. While necessary for hygiene, baths were also social spaces where reputations were established and maintained. Women in the profession often visited during specific hours or frequented particular establishments, creating informal segregation that protected respectable women from unwanted association. Cosmetics played important roles in professional presentation. Roman women used various preparations. White led to lighten complexion, red ochre for cheeks and lips, charcoal for darkening eyelashes and brows. While respectable women also used cosmetics, those in the profession typically employed heavier applications that enhanced features in lamplight and conveyed professional status. Clothing, beyond the legally required toga, varied based on economic circumstances. Wealthier workers could afford silk or fine wool garments in bright colours that attracted attention. Poorer workers made do with simpler woolen or linen clothing. Jewellery, perfumes, and elaborate hairstyles served as marketing tools, signalling quality and justifying higher prices. The actual work hours varied by season and location. Summer evenings, when Romans conducted much social life outdoors, might see activity beginning in late afternoon and continuing into night. Winter patterns shifted earlier as darkness came sooner, and indoor activities became more necessary. Waiting for clients consumed considerable time. Between active work periods, women might sit in doorways, converse with neighbours, or engage in simple crafts like spinning or weaving. These intervals, potentially extending for hours during slow periods, were part of the profession's rhythm. Client interactions varied in duration from brief encounters to extended evenings. The profession encompassed not just physical intimacy, but also companionship, conversation, and entertainment. Women with musical abilities, skill in conversation or education commanded higher prices, and enjoyed better working conditions by providing these additional services. The economics of each interaction reflected negotiation between worker and client. Prices varied based on the worker's status, reputation, physical appearance, additional skills, location, and time of day. Archaeological graffiti from Pompeii preserves occasional price information, suggesting that rates range from very modest sums for basic services to substantial amounts for more elaborate arrangements. Payment occurred in cash, the standard medium for such transactions. Roman coinage, relatively stable during most periods, facilitated commerce at all economic levels. Workers needed to manage money carefully, setting aside portions for rent, food, clothing, taxes, and, if enslaved, potentially saving toward purchasing freedom. Safety considerations shaped daily routines. Working in establishments with other women and male staff provided more security than independent work in isolated rooms. However, even establishments offered imperfect protection. Violence, theft, and abuse remained constant risks that women navigated through various strategies, including maintaining relationships with protectors, choosing clients carefully, and working in areas with some level of community oversight. The presence of male associates, whether establishment owners, doorkeepers, or informal protectors, characterized many working arrangements. These men provided security and managed difficult situations, but also took portions of earnings or maintained control over women's activities. The power dynamics in these relationships heavily favoured the men, creating dependencies that limited women's autonomy. Breaks in routine came with Roman festivals and holidays, when normal business patterns disrupted. Some festivals saw increased activity as celebrating crowds sought entertainment. Others involved closures and rest periods. Religious festivals, particularly those celebrating deities associated with love and fertility, might include special observances or offerings by women in the profession. Seasonal variations affected business patterns. Summer brought tourists and military personnel to Rome, increasing demand. Winter saw decreased activity as cold weather and shorter days reduced street traffic. These seasonal fluctuations required financial planning to sustain oneself through slower periods. The rhythm of daily life in the profession combined periods of activity, waiting, maintenance, rest, and navigation of social environments that ranged from hostile to tolerant. Each day required balancing immediate economic needs against longer-term survival, maintaining professional appearance despite limited resources, and managing the psychological toll of work that society simultaneously relied upon and condemned. Understanding the economic dimensions of this profession requires examining income, expenses, and the various financial arrangements that shaped women's material circumstances. The range of economic outcomes varied dramatically based on numerous factors. Income levels differed enormously across the profession. At the highest end, a small number of women achieved relative prosperity. These elite workers, often educated, skilled in music or conversation, and working with wealthy clients, commanded prices that allowed comfortable existences. They might accumulate savings, own property through intermediaries, and enjoy material comforts comparable to middle-class Romans. The vast majority, however, operated at modest or subsistence economic levels. Their income provided enough for basic necessities, but little beyond survival. These women lived in the crowded insulas, ate simple foods, and possessed minimal belongings. Economic security remained perpetually uncertain, with illness, age, or other factors threatening even basic subsistence. At the lowest economic level, women in desperate circumstances accepted minimal compensation, barely scraping by in Rome's most dangerous neighbourhoods. These workers, often the most vulnerable and exploited, lived in genuine poverty despite working full-time. The structure of financial arrangements significantly affected economic outcomes. Independent workers retained their full income but bore all expenses and risks. Those working in establishments split income with owners, typically keeping 1/3 to 1/2 of what clients paid. Enslaved workers retained nothing, with all income going to their owners, though some masters allowed slaves to accumulate peculium, personal savings that might eventually purchase freedom. Rent consumed significant portions of income for those working independently. Room rent in poor neighbourhoods, while modest by middle-class standards, represented substantial proportions of working-class income. Prime locations near high-traffic areas commanded premium rents that further reduced take-home earnings. Food costs, the other major expense, varied with individual circumstances. Simple foods like bread, porridge, vegetables, and occasional fish or meat made up typical diets. Women working in establishments sometimes received meals as part of their arrangements, reducing personal expenses but also increasing dependence on establishment owners. Clothing and cosmetics represented necessary professional investments. Maintaining attractive appearance required regular expenditures on garments, cosmetics, perfumes, and jewellery. These costs, while essential for attracting clients, reduced net income. The pressure to maintain appearance created ongoing financial demands that competed with savings and other needs. Taxation, as mentioned earlier, claimed portions of income. The prostitute tax, collected regularly, took percentages that varied by location and period. Failure to pay taxes could result in penalties, though enforcement varied. Women working illegally without registration avoided taxes but faced risks if authorities discovered them. Healthcare expenses arose from the occupational hazards inherent in the profession. Roman medicine, while more advanced than often credited, was expensive and of variable quality. Women dealing with health issues faced choices between expensive treatments and simply enduring conditions. The lack of effective treatments for certain health problems made some conditions chronic burdens. The possibility of pregnancy created significant economic and personal concerns. Various methods existed to prevent or terminate pregnancies, ranging from magical amulets to herbal preparations to more direct interventions. These methods varied widely in effectiveness and safety. The economic impact of pregnancy could be severe, potentially preventing work for extended periods without providing alternative income sources. Savings accumulation proved difficult but essential for long-term survival. The profession offered no retirement provisions, no pensions, no safety nets, for those too old or ill to continue working. Women who could save during their working years had options later in life. Those who couldn't faced bleak prospects as age or health problems reduced their earning capacity. The goal of purchasing freedom for enslaved workers provided motivation for saving. Manumission prices varied based on age, health, skills, and other factors. Accumulating sufficient funds required years of careful saving, assuming owners allowed peculium accumulation and honoured implicit or explicit agreements about eventual freedom. Investment opportunities existed but were largely inaccessible to women in this profession. Legal restrictions on property ownership, combined with social stigma and limited resources, prevented most from accumulating assets that generated income. A few successful women managed to acquire property through various arrangements, but these were exceptions rather than norms. Money lending, while risky, offered one avenue for deploying savings. Small-scale informal lending among working-class Romans created credit networks. Women with modest savings sometimes participated in these networks, though their marginal social position made debt collection difficult and losses likely. Mutual aid among workers in the profession provided informal insurance against hardships. Women working in the same establishments or neighbourhoods sometimes pooled resources to help those facing temporary difficulties. These solidarity networks, while limited by everyone's modest means, provided crucial support in emergencies. The absence of formal banking access for most working-class Romans meant that savings were kept as cash, hidden in homes, or entrusted to more secure individuals. This created vulnerability to theft, loss, and inflation that eroded purchasing power over time. Economic planning required balancing immediate needs against uncertain futures. Women needed to maintain professional appearance, pay ongoing expenses, and ideally save for later life, all from incomes that might barely cover current necessities. This financial tightrope required constant calculation and often impossible choices between competing needs. The most successful economic strategy, for those with options, involved transitioning out of direct work into management or ownership roles. A woman who saved enough might rent a room to others entering the profession, taking a percentage of their income. This transition, while not eliminating social stigma, provided more economic security and reduced personal risks. Inheritance laws generally disadvantaged women in the profession, particularly those who had registered officially. Their ability to pass assets to heirs faced legal complications, though informal arrangements sometimes circumvented restrictions. Children of women in the profession rarely inherited significant assets, as most workers possessed little to pass on. The economic reality for most women in this profession was precarious subsistence, interrupted by periodic crises. Illness, injury, legal troubles, or simple bad luck could devastate already fragile economic positions. The lack of safety nets meant that economic reversals quickly became life-threatening emergencies. Beyond work hours, women in this profession lived in the same urban environment as other working-class Romans, though their social stigma created additional challenges in navigating daily life. Housing for most existed in the insulae, the multi-storey apartment buildings that housed Rome's working poor. These structures, built speculatively with minimal regulation, range from relatively solid to dangerously unstable. Upper floors, cheaper but more precarious, typically house the poorest residents, including many women in this profession. The apartments themselves were cramped, dark, and minimally furnished. A single room might serve as bedroom, workroom, kitchen, and storage area. Windows, if present, were small and lacked glass, closed with wooden shutters that blocked light when secured. Heating came from charcoal braziers that created risks of fire and asphyxiation. Cooking, when done at home, occurred on these same braziers or on small portable stoves. Sanitation facilities were communal and often inadequate. Buildings might have ground-floor latrines, but upper-floor residents often used chamber pots that were emptied into jars for disposal. Public latrines existed throughout the city, providing facilities for those whose buildings lacked adequate provisions. The insulae frequently lacked running water, requiring residents to fetch water from public fountains. Fire posed constant danger in the insulae. The combination of wood construction, oil lamps, charcoal braziers, and crowded conditions created environments where fires started easily and spread rapidly. Major fires periodically swept through Roman neighbourhoods, leaving thousands homeless. For women in this profession, losing everything to fire meant catastrophic setbacks from which recovery was difficult. Neighbourhood life in areas where many women in the profession lived developed its own character. These districts, often near entertainment areas or along major roads, contained mixed populations of working-class Romans. Tabernae, small shop fronts opening onto streets sold food, wine and goods. Street life buzzed with activity from early morning through late evening. Social relationships with neighbours range from supportive to hostile. Some neighbours, themselves marginalised or pragmatic about survival in difficult circumstances, maintained normal neighbourly relations. Others, seeking to assert respectability or influenced by social prejudices, ostracised or harassed women in the profession. Navigation of neighbourhood social dynamics required constant attention to maintaining whatever acceptance was possible. Food acquisition typically involved purchasing from street vendors and small shops rather than home cooking. Bread from bakeries, prepared foods from tabernae, fruits and vegetables from markets, and occasionally wine provided typical diets. The thermopolia, establishments selling hot prepared food, offered quick meals for those without cooking facilities or time to prepare food. The social isolation resulting from stigma made daily life more difficult in countless small ways. Normal social interactions that other Romans took for granted, conversations at fountains, children's play, religious observances, were complicated by the social distance others maintained from women in the profession. This isolation created psychological burdens beyond the practical difficulties. Relationships with family, when family connections existed, were often strained or severed. Women who entered the profession frequently lost contact with parents, siblings, and extended family. The shame associated with the profession led many families to disown members engaged in it. This rupture of family ties eliminated traditional support networks that other Romans relied upon during difficulties. Friendships with others in similar circumstances provided essential emotional support. Bonds formed between women working in the same establishments, living in the same neighbourhoods, or simply encountering each other in daily rounds. These friendships, based on shared experience and mutual understanding, created substitute families for women cut off from biological relatives. Romantic relationships and marriage remained legally and practically complicated. While registration legally prohibited marriage to citizens of certain classes, informal unions existed. Some women formed partnerships with men from similarly marginalised social positions. These relationships, while providing companionship and support, often involved complex power dynamics and could create additional vulnerabilities. Children born to women in the profession faced difficult prospects. Mothers working in this capacity struggled to provide for children while continuing to work. Childcare arrangements relied on informal networks or elderly neighbours. Children growing up in these circumstances faced social stigma and limited opportunities, often perpetuating cycles of marginalisation. Religious participation, despite legal restrictions on certain observances, remained part of life for many women in the profession. Household shrines honoured protective deities. Public festivals brought opportunities to participate in community celebrations. Certain deities, particularly Venus, maintained associations with the profession, and women might offer prayers or small sacrifices seeking divine favour or protection. Healthcare, as mentioned earlier, represented constant concern. The occupational hazards of the profession created chronic health issues. Roman medicine, a mix of practical treatments and ineffective theories, provided some help but couldn't address many conditions. Women relied on folk remedies, midwives, and occasionally physicians when they could afford professional medical attention. Personal grooming and hygiene, essential for professional reasons, also contributed to general health. Regular bathing, attention to dental hygiene using various cleaning methods, and care for skin and hair all mattered both professionally and personally. The public baths provided facilities for thorough cleaning, though the hours when women in the profession could visit comfortably were often limited. Leisure time, limited as it was, might be spent in various ways. Conversation with friends, attendance at public entertainments like chariot races or gladiatorial games when free seating was available, walking through public spaces, or simply resting provided breaks from work. The same entertainments that other Romans enjoyed remained accessible, though experiences were coloured by social position. Ageing brought increasing difficulties. As physical appearance declined with age, earning capacity decreased. women who hadn't saved or developed alternative income sources faced destitution. Some transitioned into management roles, others relied on savings or support from former clients or friends. The most unfortunate ended their days in complete poverty, dependent on charity or public grain distribution. The prospect of death without family to provide proper burial created anxiety. Burial clubs, voluntary associations that collected small regular contributions and provided funeral expenses for members, offered one solution. Some women joined these associations, ensuring at least basic funeral rites, rather than disposal in common graves for the destitute. Daily life, then, combined work hours with all the mundane activities that filled any Roman's existence: obtaining food and water, maintaining living spaces, managing social relationships, attending to health, navigating neighbourhood dynamics, and planning for an uncertain future. The profession shaped these activities through social stigma and economic precarity, but the fundamental tasks of daily survival remained similar to those facing other working-class Romans. The social position of women in this profession occupied a unique and complicated space in Roman society. Understanding their status requires examining both official legal frameworks and unofficial social realities that shaped daily interactions. The concept of infamia, legal dishonour, attached to those in the profession through formal registration. This status didn't make them criminals, but placed them in a category of citizens who lacked full legal rights and social standing. Infamia affected not just women in the profession, but also actors, gladiators, and others in occupations Romans considered dishonourable, despite their legal status. The paradox of being simultaneously necessary and condemned characterised Roman attitudes. Roman men from all social classes, including the most respectable, utilised these services regularly. Yet those providing them were looked down upon and excluded from respectable society. This contradiction created complex social dynamics that women navigated daily. Interactions with respectable women range from avoidance to open hostility. Matrons typically maintained clear social distance, neither speaking to nor acknowledging women in the profession. The requirement to wear distinctive dress, the toga, facilitated this social separation by making professional status immediately visible. Public spaces thus contained visible hierarchies enforced through dress codes and social behaviour. Relationships with working-class women proved more variable. Women from poor but respectable families might live in the same neighbourhoods as those in the profession. While social distance remained, practical necessities of daily life created some interactions. Sharing public fountains, shopping at the same markets, and living in proximity sometimes fostered minimal social connections based on shared economic struggles rather than social acceptance. Children provided particularly poignant examples of social boundaries. Children of women in the profession were often ostracised by other children, reflecting their parents' attitudes. This childhood exclusion created early awareness of social stigma that shaped entire lives. Some children of women in the profession managed to escape their origin stigma, but many carried social disadvantages throughout their lives. The attitudes of men varied widely. Clients obviously interacted regularly, but these interactions occurred within commercial contexts that maintained social boundaries outside of work situations. Working-class men in neighbourhoods where many women in the profession lived might maintain pragmatic relationships based on proximity, while still observing social distinctions. Elite men typically denied in public having any association with the profession while privately being regular clients. Merchants and shopkeepers in areas with concentrations of women in the profession developed business relationships that might be cordial, but remained clearly commercial. These merchants sold goods and services to women in the profession, accepting their money while maintaining social distance that preserved their own respectability. Landlords renting to women in the profession occupied ambiguous positions. They profited from rent while often looking down on tenants. This relationship created tensions, with landlords sometimes exploiting tenants' marginal social position through higher rents or poor maintenance, while knowing that tenants had limited recourse. Law enforcement, from local magistrates to the urban cohorts who policed Rome's streets, interacted with women in the profession primarily as regulators. Officials collected taxes, enforced registration requirements, and occasionally intervened in disputes. These official interactions, while not necessarily hostile, reinforced the power dynamics that placed women in the profession at the bottom of social hierarchies. Legal proceedings involving women in the profession highlighted their marginal status. Their testimony carried less weight than that of respectable citizens. Accusations against them received more credence than their own accusations against others. Legal protections, while theoretically present, proved difficult to access practically. Courts that might vigorously pursue theft from respectable citizens showed less interest in similar crimes against women in the profession. The possibility of social redemption existed in theory, but proved nearly impossible in practice. A woman who left the profession, whether through purchasing freedom if enslaved, or simply ceasing work if free, carried the stigma permanently. Former workers who attempted to reintegrate into respectable society found themselves blocked by their pasts. The profession marked women permanently in social terms, even when legal status technically changed. Religious attitudes added another layer of complexity. While official religious observances excluded women in the profession from certain rites, popular religion proved more accommodating. Protective deities, healing gods, and especially Venus, received worship from women in the profession seeking divine assistance. Temples and shrines accepted their offerings and prayers, creating religious spaces somewhat removed from social hierarchies. Charitable institutions, particularly those with Christian influences in later imperial periods, sometimes offered assistance to women seeking to leave the profession. These institutions, motivated by religious teachings about redemption and moral reform, created some limited pathways out. However, their capacity was tiny compared to the numbers in the profession, and their assistance often came with moral judgment that created its own difficulties. Burial practices reflected social status. Women in the profession who died without resources faced disposal in common graves for the poor. Those who had saved or joined burial associations received basic funeral rites. The elaborate tomb monuments that marked the graves of respectable Romans were generally inaccessible, though a few particularly successful women managed to commemorate themselves through funerary inscriptions. The social invisibility of women in the profession in many historical sources reflects their marginalized status. Elite Roman writers rarely discussed them except in moral diatribes or comedic contexts. Legal sources mention them primarily in terms of regulations. The lives, thoughts, feelings, and experiences of actual women largely go unrecorded, their voices silenced by social structures that deem them unworthy of documentation. Archaeological evidence provides more democratic documentation. Graffiti from Pompeii, inscribed by workers themselves or by clients, preserves names, prices, and occasional personal messages. These informal texts, never intended for posterity, offer glimpses into lived experiences that literary sources ignore. The physical spaces where women worked, preserved at Pompeii and other sites, provide material evidence about daily realities. Modern historical approaches increasingly attempt to reconstruct the experiences of marginalized people, whose voices are absent from traditional sources. Careful reading of existing documents, archaeological evidence, comparative anthropological studies, and feminist historical methodologies help build understanding of lives that Roman elite considered beneath notice. The social reality for women in this profession, then, involved daily navigation of a society that simultaneously depended upon and despised them. They were visible through their required dress, yet socially invisible in broader civic life. They provided services to men of all classes, yet couldn't claim the social respect those same men accorded to their wives and daughters. This paradoxical existence shaped every interaction and every aspect of daily life. The physical and psychological toll of working in this profession represented constant concerns that shaped daily life and long-term outcomes. Understanding these health dimensions requires careful attention to both ancient medical knowledge and the specific circumstances women faced. Occupational health risks inherent in the profession created chronic concerns. The nature of the work exposed women to various health conditions that Roman medicine addressed with limited effectiveness. Prevention methods existed but varied widely in reliability and accessibility. Herbal preparations formed the primary pregnancy prevention methods. Various plants, including pennyroyal, juniper, and others, were believed to prevent conception or terminate early pregnancies. These preparations varied in effectiveness and safety. Some had genuine contraceptive or abortifacient properties, though dosing was imprecise and side effects could be severe. Others were essentially ineffective, providing false security while offering no real protection. Barrier methods using materials like wool or linen soaked in various substances offered alternative prevention approaches. These physical barriers, while less effective than modern methods, provided some protection. The knowledge and use of these methods varied, with more established workers having better access to information and materials. The economic and practical implications of pregnancy made prevention crucial. Pregnancy meant lost income during later stages when work became impractical, childbirth risks in an era of high maternal mortality, and the burden of a child who required resources while potentially preventing future work. Women in the profession thus had strong motivations to prevent pregnancies. When pregnancies occurred despite prevention efforts, various responses existed. Some women continued pregnancies and attempted to care for children while working. Others sought abortions through herbal preparations or more direct interventions. The safety and legality of these options varied, with wealthy women having access to better care than poor workers who might resort to dangerous methods. Exposure to various contagious conditions represented another occupational hazard. Roman cities, crowded and lacking modern sanitation, facilitated disease transmission. Certain conditions specifically associated with this type of work could become chronic, causing ongoing health problems that affected both work capacity and general well-being. Roman medicine, while sophisticated in some ways, couldn't effectively treat many conditions. Physicians could diagnose certain problems and offer treatments, but therapeutic options were limited. Herbal remedies, surgical interventions for some conditions, and various dietary recommendations provided what help was available. Magical and religious approaches supplemented medical treatments, reflecting the era's integrated understanding of health and spirituality. The cost of medical care meant that many women delayed or avoided seeking treatment. Physicians charged fees that might be prohibitive for those living marginally. Self-treatment using folk remedies, advice from other workers, or simply enduring conditions without treatment characterized many women's experiences with health problems. Mental and emotional health, while not conceptualized in modern psychological terms, nonetheless affected women's well-being. The social isolation, stigma, occupational stress, and often traumatic circumstances that led women into the profession created psychological burdens. Ancient sources rarely address these psychological dimensions, but the human cost can be inferred from the circumstances. Violence represented constant risk. Clients could become aggressive, disputes could escalate, and women's marginal social status meant they had limited recourse against mistreatment. Physical injuries from violence required treatment but also created fear and stress that affected mental well-being. The absence of effective protection meant women developed their own safety strategies, none entirely reliable. Aging brought specific health challenges. The physical demands of the work affected bodies over time. Common health problems among aging women included chronic pain, mobility limitations, and various conditions that reduced quality of life. Without modern healthcare or social support systems, aging workers faced declining health, with minimal resources for addressing problems. Substance use, particularly wine consumption, raised concerns. Wine, drunk throughout Roman society, could provide temporary escape from difficult realities. However, reliance on alcohol created its own problems, including economic burdens, health effects, and impaired judgment that increased risks. Roman moralists condemned excessive drinking, particularly by women, though their judgments focused more on moral failure than health consequences. Nutrition affected health, but was constrained by economic circumstances. The simple diet of bread, porridge, and occasional other foods provided basic sustenance, but might lack nutritional variety. Periods of economic difficulty could mean genuine hunger that further compromised health. The link between nutrition and health, while not fully understood by Romans, was recognized in general terms. Sleep patterns, dictated by work hours that extended into evenings and nights, might not align with natural circadian rhythms. Chronic sleep disruption affected both physical and mental health, though Romans didn't conceptualize sleep in modern terms. The necessity of remaining alert and presentable during evening hours when business occurred meant that rest patterns were adapted to professional demands rather than biological needs. Personal hygiene, essential for both professional and health reasons, required regular attention. Bathing, while beneficial for preventing some conditions, could not address all health risks. The public bath's warm, moist environment could facilitate transmission of some conditions even while promoting cleanliness. Women balanced the hygiene benefits of bathing against potential risks and costs. Injury, from accidents or violence, required treatment that ranged from self-care to professional medical attention, depending on severity and resources. Broken bones, cuts, bruises, and other injuries occurred regularly in working-class Roman life, and women in the profession were not exempt. Healing without modern interventions meant extended recovery periods with associated lost income. Dental health, a universal concern in ancient world before modern dentistry, affected working-class Romans, including women in this profession. Tooth decay, gum disease, and tooth loss created both pain and practical problems. Roman dental care included extraction of problematic teeth, but could not address underlying causes of dental problems. Loss of teeth affected appearance, potentially impacting earning capacity for those whose professional success depended partly on attractiveness. The cumulative effect of occupational health risks, limited medical care, economic precarity, psychological stress, and lack of social support created health outcomes worse than those of many other Roman workers. While comparative data doesn't exist, the combination of risk factors suggests that women in this profession experienced more health problems and shorter lifespans than average for their social class. Attempts to maintain health despite these challenges shaped daily routines and decisions. Women balanced immediate economic needs against health maintenance, often choosing immediate income over long-term well-being because survival required it. The agency to prioritize health required economic security that most lacked. Understanding how women entered this profession, and whether exit paths existed, provides essential context for comprehending their experiences and options throughout their involvement. The pathways into the profession varied considerably, with some routes involving more choice than others. Economic desperation drove many women into the work. Without modern social safety nets, Roman women facing destitution had limited survival options. For those without family support, suitable marriage prospects, or access to respectable employment, the profession offered income when alternatives were absent. Debt, both personal and familial, created another pathway. Roman debt law allowed creditors significant powers over debtors, though slavery for debt became less common over time. Women from families unable to pay debts sometimes entered the profession as means of generating income to address obligations. Once registered, however, the social and legal consequences often proved permanent even after debts were satisfied. Enslavement through various mechanisms represented a major pathway into the profession for many women. Those captured in wars, children of enslaved parents, or individuals sold into slavery through various circumstances might be placed into this work by owners seeking profit. Enslaved women had no legal authority to refuse work assignments, making choice meaningless in their circumstances. Trafficking, while not conceptualized in modern terms, existed in practice. Traders acquired or kidnapped women and girls, sometimes from distant provinces, and transported them to Roman cities where they were sold to establishment owners or individual buyers. These women, often separated from families and communities, entered the profession through coercion with no realistic options for resistance. The role of family members selling children into this work, while disturbing, occurred particularly among desperately poor families facing starvation. Parents might sell children to traders or directly to establishment owners, receiving payment that allowed remaining family members to survive. These transactions, legal under Roman law, reflected the harsh realities of poverty in the ancient world. Abandonment of infants, particularly girls, created vulnerable populations. Romans practiced exposure of unwanted infants, leaving them in public places. Some abandoned children were rescued by those who raised them for eventual work in various capacities, including this profession. These children, lacking family connections or legal protections, became particularly vulnerable to exploitation. The idea of voluntary entry must be examined carefully. Some women, aware of the profession's existence and desperate for income, might have approached establishment owners seeking work. However, choice in contexts of extreme economic desperation, limited alternatives, and information asymmetries about what the work would actually entail requires careful qualification before being termed truly voluntary. Once in the profession, various mechanisms kept women involved even if they wished to leave. For enslaved women, legal bondage provided absolute barrier to exit without owner's consent. Manumission, when it occurred, required either purchase of freedom using saved peculium, grant of freedom by owner, or rare circumstances like freedom stipulated in owner's will. Free women faced different but substantial barriers to exit. The legal registration that allowed them to work also permanently marked their social status. The infamia attached to registration couldn't be expunged, meaning that even women who ceased work carried social stigma permanently. This lasting consequence deterred some from registering, but unregistered work carried its own risks. Economic barriers to exit proved formidable. Accumulating savings sufficient to sustain oneself without continuing to work required years of careful financial management, assuming income sufficient for both immediate needs and savings. Most women earned barely enough for survival, making accumulation impossible. Without savings, leaving meant facing immediate destitution. Lack of alternative employment options trapped women in the profession even when they desired exit. Respectable employment opportunities for women were extremely limited in Roman society. Those available, like spinning, weaving, or wet nursing, typically paid less than work in this profession, and often required connections or skills women lacked. The practical impossibility of earning sufficient income through alternative means kept many in the profession. Age eventually forced exit whether desired or not. As physical appearance declined and health problems accumulated, women could no longer attract clients or perform work. This involuntary exit without financial preparation left elderly former workers in desperate circumstances. Some became dependent on charity, others on support from former clients or friends, and the least fortunate faced destitution and early death. Marriage offered theoretical exit path, but practical barriers limited this option. The legal restrictions on marriage for registered women to certain social classes meant potential husbands came from similarly marginal populations. Finding partners willing and able to provide economic support proved difficult. Men in positions to offer comfortable support rarely married women from the profession, preferring respectable wives. Religious redemption programs, particularly those sponsored by Christian communities in later imperial periods, created limited exit pathways. These programs offered support to women leaving the profession, sometimes providing basic necessities and assistance finding alternative work. However, these initiatives were small in scale and often required extended periods in religious communities, essentially trading one controlled environment for another. Establishment of independent businesses represented aspiration for some women. Those who managed to save might rent rooms to others in the profession, transition into management roles, or establish small tabernae selling food or goods. These transitions, while not eliminating social stigma, provided more security and autonomy than continued direct work in the profession. The death rate among women in the profession, likely higher than general population due to occupational risks and poor health outcomes, represented another form of exit. Many women died while still working, never achieving the exit they might have desired. Burial in common graves or through burial association provisions provided final destinations for those whose lives ended in the profession. Documentation of successful exits remains sparse in historical sources. The sources that mention women in the profession typically discuss them in their working roles, not their later lives if they managed to leave. This documentary silence means that successful transitions out of the profession, if they occurred, left little trace for modern historians to analyse. The reality for most women was that entry into the profession proved far easier than exit from it. The combination of legal barriers, economic constraints, social stigma, and limited alternatives created situations where, once involved, women remained in the profession for extended periods or until circumstances forced cessation of work without preparation for alternative livelihoods. Roman attitudes toward this profession, expressed through literature, art, law, and social practice, reveal complex and often contradictory cultural perspectives that shaped how the profession and those in it were understood and treated. Literary representations varied widely in tone and purpose. Elite Roman writers discussed the profession in several contexts: moral diatribes condemning vice, comedic works featuring stock characters from the profession, legal discussions about regulations, and occasionally in sympathetic or neutral terms in fictional narratives. The comedy tradition, inherited from Greek theatre, and adapted to Roman sensibilities, frequently featured characters from this profession. These theatrical depictions, while nominally entertainment, reinforce stereotypes and social attitudes. The characters typically appeared as comic figures, clever or foolish, but rarely as fully realised human beings with interior lives and complex motivations. Moral writings by philosophers and moralists frequently invoked the profession as example of vice and social corruption. These writers, concerned with maintaining Roman virtue and social order, portrayed the profession as threat to morality and family stability. The actual women working in it received little consideration. They served primarily as abstract examples in moral arguments about proper behaviour. Satire, a literary genre Romans developed extensively, often featured the profession and those in it as targets of mockery or vehicles for social criticism. Satirists like Juvenal and Martial mentioned women in the profession to lampoon various social types, or to make points about Roman decadence. These satirical portrayals, while sometimes amusing to ancient audiences, contributed to dehumanization through ridicule. Legal texts, as discussed earlier, addressed the profession in regulatory terms. These sources, focused on taxation, registration, and social order, treated women in the profession as administrative categories rather than individuals. The bureaucratic language of legal regulation created its own form of dehumanization through reduction to legal status and economic function. Artistic representations appeared in various contexts. Wall paintings from Pompeii and other sites sometimes depicted scenes related to the profession. These images ranged from explicit to suggestive, serving various purposes from advertisement to decoration to personal expression. The artistic tradition around the profession reflected and reinforced social attitudes, while also revealing aspects of daily life. Graffiti, the most democratic form of Roman written expression, includes numerous references to the profession. Names, prices, endorsements, and occasional personal messages scratched into walls preserve direct evidence about daily realities. These informal texts, while brief, provide invaluable insights precisely because they weren't filtered through elite literary conventions. The contrast between public condemnation and private utilization represented fundamental hypocrisy in Roman attitudes. Men from all social classes, including those who publicly expressed moral outrage about the profession, privately utilized these services regularly. This disconnect between public morality and private behavior created the social space in which the profession could exist despite official disapproval. Religious attitudes, as mentioned earlier, involved complexity. Traditional Roman religion maintained associations between certain deities and the profession, particularly Venus in her various aspects. This religious dimension suggested ancient understandings that connected divine forces with human drives, creating frameworks that, while not eliminating stigma, provided some religious legitimacy. Christian attitudes, increasingly influential in later imperial periods, condemned the profession as sinful, while sometimes offering redemption possibilities. Christian writers portrayed women in the profession as fallen souls needing salvation, combining moral condemnation with theoretical hope for redemption. This religious framework influenced later European attitudes toward the profession for centuries. The medical literature, written by physicians like Soranus and Galen, occasionally discussed health issues related to the profession. These medical texts, while limited in scope, represent more neutral discussions focused on practical health concerns rather than moral judgments. The medical perspective, while not free from contemporary biases, approached the profession's health dimensions more objectively than moral or legal sources. Popular attitudes, difficult to reconstruct from elite sources, likely varied widely based on personal experience and social position. Working-class Romans living in proximity to women in the profession might develop pragmatic attitudes based on daily interaction. Elite Romans, maintaining social distance, might hold more abstract views, shaped by literary stereotypes and moral teachings rather than personal knowledge. Gender dynamics profoundly influenced attitudes. Roman men's perspectives differed from Roman women's views, with complex intersections of class, status, and personal circumstances affecting both. Respectable women's hostility toward women in the profession reflected partly genuine moral concern and partly anxiety about their own positions in patriarchal society, where they competed indirectly for male attention and resources. The vocabulary used to discuss the profession, and those in it, reveals much about attitudes. Latin included numerous terms, ranging from relatively neutral to explicitly derogatory, for describing women in this work. The linguistic range reflected social attitudes while also reinforcing them through repeated use of particular terms in particular contexts. Historical memory of individual women in the profession is almost entirely absent from surviving sources. While sources mention the profession extensively, individual women's names, stories, and perspectives rarely appear. This erasure from historical memory reflects their marginalised social position and the elite bias in source survival. Modern historical work attempts to recover these lost voices through careful reading of available evidence. The archaeological evidence, particularly from Pompeii, provides more democratic documentation. Physical spaces, objects, and inscriptions preserve information about daily realities without the filtering effect of literary conventions. These material remains allow modern scholars to reconstruct aspects of lived experience that literary sources ignore. Cultural representations influenced actual practices and attitudes in reciprocal relationships. Literary stereotypes shaped how Romans understood the profession, which in turn influenced how they treated women in it. Artistic representations reinforce certain images while potentially challenging others. The interaction between representation and reality created complex feedback loops that shaped both. The study of this profession in ancient Rome provides insights not just into one aspect of Roman society, but into broader patterns of social organisation, gender relations, economic structures, and human experience across historical periods. The methodological challenges in studying this topic reflect broader issues in recovering histories of marginalised people. The sources are biased, incomplete, and filtered through elite perspectives. Archaeological evidence provides some correctives but raises interpretation questions. Modern scholars must carefully construct historical understanding from fragmentary and problematic evidence. Feminist scholarship, particularly since the mid-20th century, has transformed approaches to studying women in the profession. Rather than accepting moralizing frameworks that dominated earlier scholarship, feminist historians ask different questions focused on agency, experience, economic realities, and social structures. This methodological shift has produced richer, more nuanced historical understanding. Comparative approaches, examining the profession across different historical periods and cultures, reveal both cultural specifics and human universals. The particular legal and social frameworks differed in Rome compared to other societies, but certain patterns repeat across contexts. Comparative study helps identify what was uniquely Roman versus what reflects broader human patterns. The ethical dimensions of studying this topic require careful attention. Modern scholars must avoid both romanticizing and demonizing, recognizing the complex realities of lives shaped by limited options, social structures, economic necessity, and individual choices within constrained circumstances. The goal is understanding, not judgment, while acknowledging genuine suffering. The relevance of this historical topic to contemporary issues creates both opportunities and challenges. Understanding historical patterns of marginalization, exploitation, and survival strategies illuminates modern discussions while avoiding an anachronistic equation of ancient and modern circumstances. The historical example provides context without prescribing modern policy. The social history approach that examines daily lives rather than just elite politics or major events reflects broader historiographical trends toward inclusive history. By studying women in this profession, historians recover voices and experiences that traditional historical narratives ignored, creating more complete understanding of how ancient societies actually functioned. The legal history component, examining how Roman law addressed the profession, reveals broader principles of Roman legal thinking about regulation, social order, and individual rights. Roman legal approaches influenced later European legal traditions, making this historical example relevant to legal history broadly. The economic history dimensions illuminate Roman urban economies, working-class survival strategies, and the complex economic structures underlying daily life. The profession represents one element in larger economic systems that sustained urban populations through exchange of services and resources. Gender history perspectives examine how Roman constructions of gender-shaped options for women, attitudes toward the profession, and the broader gender dynamics in Roman society. Understanding this profession requires understanding Roman gender ideology and how it structured social possibilities. The public health history, examining disease patterns, medical knowledge, and health outcomes, provides insights into Roman medicine and public health more broadly. The occupational health risks faced by women in this profession illuminate larger patterns of health and disease in ancient urban populations. Cultural history approaches analysing representations, attitudes, and symbolic meanings reveal Roman cultural values and anxieties. How Romans discussed and represented the profession indicates broader cultural concerns about sexuality, morality, social order, and gender roles. The archaeological contributions to understanding this topic demonstrate the value of material evidence for recovering aspects of life that literary sources ignore or distort. Sites like Pompeii provide irreplaceable evidence about spatial organisation, daily practices, and lived experience. Digital humanities approaches, including database creation, spatial analysis, and network analysis, offer new tools for studying this topic. Systematic analysis of scattered references, mapping of locations, and network reconstruction of relationships create new insights impossible through traditional source reading alone. The pedagogical value of studying this topic in university courses lies partly in challenging students to think critically about sources, bias, marginalisation, and historical reconstruction. The topic requires careful analytical thinking about evidence, interpretation, and the ethics of historical inquiry. The continued fascination with this topic in popular culture reflects both prurient interest and genuine curiosity about lives so different from modern experience. Scholarly work helps counter popular misconceptions while satisfying legitimate interest in understanding how other societies organised intimate commerce. The comparison to modern contexts, while requiring careful attention to differences, provides perspective on contemporary debates about similar issues. Historical understanding doesn't provide simple answers to modern questions, but does illuminate how different societies addressed related challenges. As this exploration of daily life in ancient Rome's oldest profession reaches its conclusion, the complexity of these women's experiences becomes clear. They were neither the romantic figures popular culture sometimes portrays nor simply victims without agency. They were human beings navigating difficult circumstances, making choices within constrained options, and surviving in a society that simultaneously relied upon and rejected them. The women who worked in this profession in ancient Rome have left a little direct record of their voices, their thoughts, their feelings about their lives. The sources that survive were written by others, primarily elite men whose perspectives dominated historical record. Yet careful historical work can recover something of their experiences through reading sources critically, examining archaeological evidence, and applying sophisticated historical methodologies. Understanding their daily lives, the work routines, economic realities, living conditions, social interactions, health challenges, and limited options, provides insights into Roman society more broadly. How societies treat their most marginalised members reveals much about social values, power structures, and the gap between stated ideals and lived realities. The legal frameworks Romans created to regulate this profession reflected their practical approach to governance. Rather than attempting to eliminate what they considered inevitable, they regulated, taxed, and attempted to contain social implications. This pragmatic, if harsh, approach characterised much Roman law and administration. The economic dimensions, from individual financial struggles to macro-level contributions to urban economies, show how the profession integrated into broader economic structures. The income these women earned, the taxes they paid, the goods and services they consumed all contributed to Roman economic systems. The social stigma attached to the profession, combined with its legal status and practical acceptance, reveals Roman society's contradictions around sexuality, gender, and morality. Public condemnation coexisted with private utilisation. Official regulation existed alongside social ostracism, creating the paradoxical space these women inhabited. Their daily lives, stripped of both romanticisation and excessive condemnation, reveal human beings doing difficult work in challenging circumstances. They maintained households, navigated neighbourhoods, formed friendships, worried about health and money, planned for futures, and experienced the full range of human emotions despite their marginalised positions. The pathways into the profession reflected the limited options available to poor women in Roman society. Economic desperation, enslavement, abandonment, debt, and trafficking all channeled vulnerable women into this work. The rarity of genuine choice in entering the profession casts light on broader patterns of inequality and exploitation in ancient societies. The difficulties of exiting the profession, whether through legal barriers, economic constraints, or social stigma, meant that involvement often extended throughout working lives. The absence of safety nets for aging or ill workers created vulnerability that shaped every decision during working years. The cultural representations, from literature to art to law, shaped attitudes while revealing Roman anxieties about sexuality, morality, and social order. How Romans discussed and depicted the profession tells us much about their broader cultural values and concerns. The modern study of this topic employs sophisticated historical methodologies to recover experiences from fragmentary evidence. The work of historians, archaeologists, and scholars across disciplines continues to deepen understanding of these marginalised lives. For contemporary readers, this historical exploration offers perspective on timeless human challenges, how societies balance pragmatism with ideals, how economic necessity shapes choices, how marginalised people navigate hostile environments, and how historians work to recover voices that dominant narratives have silenced. The women who worked in ancient Rome's oldest profession deserve historical attention, not as moral lessons or titillating curiosities, but as human beings whose experiences illuminate broader historical patterns and whose lives, however marginalised, were real and meaningful to those who lived them. Thank you for joining this exploration of daily life in ancient Rome's most stigmatised profession. May the insights gained provide understanding of historical realities while illuminating timeless questions about human society, economic structures, and the experiences of marginalised people across all historical periods. Until next time, rest well. Beyond the commercial aspects of their profession, women developed various personal relationships that shaped their emotional lives and daily experiences. Understanding these connections reveals the human dimensions often absent from legal and economic discussions. Friendships among women in the profession provided essential emotional support and practical assistance. These relationships, forged through shared experiences and mutual understanding, created networks that helped women survive circumstances that might otherwise have been unbearable. Friends shared advice about clients, warned each other about dangers, lent money during emergencies, and provided companionship that eased social isolation. The bonds between women working in the same establishment often resembled family relationships. Living in close proximity, sharing work experiences, and navigating similar challenges created intimacies that could be deeper than biological family ties. These chosen families provided support that women's biological families, often lost or estranged, no longer offered. Mentorship relationships between experienced workers and those newer to the profession served important functions. Veteran workers taught newcomers practical skills about managing clients, avoiding problems, handling money, and surviving emotionally. This knowledge transfer, passed informally from woman to woman, represented accumulated wisdom about navigating the profession's challenges successfully. Romantic relationships, while complicated by professional circumstances, nonetheless developed. Women in the profession fell in love, formed partnerships, and maintained relationships despite the challenges their work created. These romantic connections might involve clients who became regular partners, other workers in same-gender relationships, men from working-class backgrounds, or occasionally even attempts at relationships with men from higher social levels. The relationships with regular clients who became something more than simple commercial transactions occupied ambiguous space. Some clients developed genuine affection for specific workers, returning regularly not just for services but for companionship and conversation. These ongoing relationships, while still fundamentally commercial, sometimes evolved into something more complex involving genuine emotional connection, alongside financial transaction. The power dynamics in relationships with clients remained inherently unbalanced. Clients controlled money, held higher social status, and possessed the option to walk away without consequence. Women in the profession, dependent on client income and vulnerable to client displeasure, navigated these relationships carefully. Even when genuine affection developed, the underlying inequality shaped every interaction. Relationships with men who served as protectors created dependencies that limited women's autonomy while providing some security. These men, sometimes called pimps in modern terminology, though Roman vocabulary used different terms, provided protection against violence and helped manage difficult situations. However, they also controlled women's activities and claimed portions of income, making these relationships fundamentally exploitative despite any genuine emotional elements. The possibility of being kept by a single wealthy patron represented aspiration for some women. A wealthy man might establish a woman in her own apartment, provide regular financial support, and essentially remove her from active work in the profession. These arrangements, while not marriage and lacking legal recognition, offered comfort and security that made them attractive despite the complete dependency they created. Marriage, as discussed earlier, remained legally complicated but not entirely impossible. Informal unions without legal recognition allowed women to form households with partners. Children born from these unions faced social disadvantages, but at least had two parents attempting to provide for them. The stability these informal marriages offered, while always precarious, represented something approaching normal family life. The relationships with children, for women who bore and kept children, involved complicated emotional terrain. Mothers working in the profession wanted to protect children from their circumstances, provide better futures, and maintain parent-child bonds despite professional realities. The practical challenges of working while caring for children required community support and creative arrangements. Relationships with neighbours range from supportive to hostile depending on individual circumstances and neighbourhood character. In areas where many women in the profession lived, neighbours might develop pragmatic, even friendly relationships based on shared working-class struggles. In more mixed neighbourhoods, relationships might be more difficult, with respectable neighbours maintaining distance or expressing open hostility. The connections with shopkeepers, tavern owners, and other merchants who served neighbourhoods created commercial relationships that sometimes deepened into something more personal. These business relationships involved daily interactions over months and years, creating familiarity that could develop into genuine friendships despite social barriers. Relationships with religious figures represented another dimension of personal connection. Some priests and temple attendants, recognizing the humanity behind the stigma, treated women in the profession with basic respect and accepted their offerings and prayers. These positive religious relationships provided spiritual comfort and sense of being recognized as human beings worthy of divine attention. The occasional relationships with physicians or healers who treated women in the profession with professional respect rather than moral judgment stood out as particularly valued. Medical practitioners who prioritized health over morality provided essential services while treating patients as human beings deserving care. Relationships among women across different levels of the profession's hierarchy proved complex. Elite workers might look down on those at lower levels, replicating broader social hierarchies within the profession itself. However, recognition of shared fundamental circumstances also created potential for solidarity across economic differences. The relationships with former clients who remained friends or supporters after the commercial relationship ended represented particularly valued connections. These friendships, stripped of financial transaction but maintaining personal connection, validated women's worth beyond their professional capacity and provided emotional support. Letters, for women who were literate or could pay scribes, allowed maintenance of relationships across distance. Communication with friends who had moved to other cities, with family members who remained in contact despite disapproval, or with clients travelling away from Rome sustained connections that distance might otherwise have severed. The role of memory in maintaining relationships with deceased friends or partners shaped emotional lives. Women in the profession, like all Romans, honoured deceased loved ones through memory and, when possible, funeral rites or graveside observances. These practices connected present lives with lost relationships, maintaining continuity across time. Relationships with animals, particularly dogs or cats, provided companionship for some women. These pets, while requiring care and feeding, offered unconditional affection and companionship that human relationships complicated by profession and stigma often couldn't match. The simple presence of a loyal animal companion eased loneliness and provided emotional comfort. The progression from active work through declining earning capacity to eventual complete withdrawal from the profession created profound challenges that shaped women's experiences and planning throughout their working lives. The first signs of aging affected earning capacity well before ending work entirely. Physical changes in appearance, the primary asset for many workers, began diminishing market value while women were still relatively young by modern standards. Lines around eyes, grey hairs, changes in skin tone, and the general effects of hard living became apparent by the late 20s or early 30s for many women. The decline in income as physical appearance changed created escalating anxiety. Women watched their earning capacity decrease year by year, knowing that the trajectory led inevitably toward inability to continue working. This decline happened gradually enough that immediate survival remained possible, while long-term prospects became increasingly dire. Attempts to slow or hide aging consumed time and resources. Women used cosmetics more heavily to cover signs of age, maintained elaborate hairstyles that concealed grey hair, and employed various remedies and preparations claimed to restore youthful appearance. These efforts, while sometimes temporarily effective, couldn't reverse inevitable biological processes. The shift in clientele as women age reflected market realities. Younger, wealthier clients with options increasingly chose younger workers. Older women found themselves working with older clients, those willing to pay less, or those with particular preferences. This market segmentation meant that aging workers moved down economic hierarchies even while continuing to work. The development of alternative skills provided some workers with transition possibilities. Women who learned management skills might transition into supervising roles in establishments. Those who developed expertise in beauty preparations might sell cosmetics. Others might operate small food or drink businesses, leveraging hospitality experience gained through years in the profession. The accumulation of savings discussed earlier as constant concern became urgent imperative as aging progressed. Women who hadn't saved during peak earning years faced destitution when they could no longer work. The few who had saved carefully found their resources stretched thin as they lasted years or even decades after active work ended. The purchase of small businesses or rental properties represented the most secure retirement strategy. Women who accumulated sufficient capital might buy small shops that generated modest but steady income. Renting rooms to others in the profession provided income while leveraging intimate knowledge of the business. These investments required substantial capital that few workers accumulated. The transition into care roles for children or elderly represented another survival strategy. Women too old for active professional work might care for children of working mothers, either informally in exchange for support or as paid childcare providers. Similarly, caring for elderly or ill community members offered potential income through practical nursing work. The possibility of continuing work at greatly reduced rates allowed survival, even when attracting premium clients became impossible. Women willing to accept minimal compensation could continue generating some income into their 40s or 50s. This extended working life while preventing immediate destitution meant enduring decades of hard work for subsistence-level income. The reliance on support from former clients or friends represented common strategy in later life. Women who had maintained good relationships might receive assistance from men who remembered them fondly, or felt obligation to help. This support, while never guaranteed and often minimal, sometimes meant the difference between survival and destitution. Religious institutions providing charitable support offered another potential resource. Christian churches, increasingly present in later imperial Rome, sometimes assisted the poor, including former workers from the profession seeking to leave. These charitable programs, motivated by religious teachings about redemption, provided basic necessities and sometimes small stipends. The burial societies discussed earlier became crucial in later life. Membership in collegia or burial associations ensured that at least final expenses would be covered and basic funeral rites performed. For women without family to provide burial, these associations prevented the final indignity of disposal in common graves for the unclaimed poor. The development of chronic health problems complicated aging. Years of hard work, poor nutrition, limited health care, and occupational health risks culminated in bodies worn out prematurely. Conditions that modern medicine manages easily became progressively debilitating, affecting quality of life and ability to perform any work. Pain management, with only limited effective treatments available, became daily concern. Roman pain remedies included various herbal preparations, some with genuine analgesic properties and others essentially ineffective. Women endured chronic pain that gradually worsened, finding whatever relief they could through available methods while continuing to function as necessity demanded. The psychological aspects of aging in this profession involved confronting difficult realities. Women who had survived through youth and beauty now faced marginalisation, even within their already stigmatised profession. The loss of the one asset that had provided survival required difficult psychological adjustments and often contributed to depression or despair. The occasional examples of women who achieved relative comfort in later life provided hope and aspiration. Stories circulated about particularly successful workers who had saved wisely, invested cleverly, and secured their retirements. These exceptional cases, while rare, demonstrated that escape from eventual destitution was possible and motivated others to attempt similar paths. The contrast between early retirement through accumulated savings and forced retirement through declining capacity created different experiences of later life. Women who stopped working by choice from positions of relative security experienced aging very differently than those who continued working until absolutely unable to continue. The care by younger women in the profession for elderly former workers created informal social services. A woman who had worked for decades might be housed and fed by younger workers who remembered her kindness or assistance when they were new to the profession. These acts of solidarity, while limited by everyone's modest means, preserved dignity and prevented the worst outcomes. The final illnesses and deaths of women in the profession, like those of all working-class Romans, often occurred without the medical attention or family support that would have eased suffering. Women died in their small rooms, sometimes alone, sometimes attended by friends, occasionally in public hospitals for the poor that provided basic care during final days. The grief among friends and community when women died reflected genuine human connections that transcended the profession's stigma. Funerals, whether through burial associations or private arrangements, allowed those who had known the deceased to mourn, remember and honour lives that broader society rarely acknowledged. The inscriptions on occasional tombstones of women from the profession provide rare direct evidence of their lives. These brief texts, typically recording just name and age, represent almost the only permanent records that these women existed as individuals. Modern historians treasure these fragments, the only voice remaining from lives otherwise lost to history. The rhythm of Roman life, structured around agricultural seasons, religious festivals and traditional celebrations, created varying patterns in the profession that women needed to navigate and plan around throughout the year. Spring brought renewed activity after winter's relative quiet. As weather improved, travel increased, bringing visitors to cities. Agricultural work in surrounding countryside reduced as planting completed, allowing rural Romans to visit cities. This increased urban activity translated into more potential clients and busier working periods. The spring festivals, particularly those honouring Venus and other deities associated with fertility and love, created special occasions. During Veneralia, celebrated on April 1st, women gathered at Venus's temple making offerings and prayers. Women in the profession, particularly devoted to Venus as patron deity, participated in these observances with special attention. The Floralia, celebrated in late April and early May, featured festivities particularly associated with the profession. This festival honouring Flora, goddess of flowers and spring, included theatrical performances, games, and celebrations where normal social restraints relaxed somewhat. The festival provided opportunities for increased business and participation in public celebrations. Summer represented peak season for the profession in most locations. The warm weather extended hours when people were active on streets. Military campaigns brought soldiers through cities. Trading increased as seas became safer for shipping. All these factors combined to create busy periods when income peaked for most workers. The summer heat, while drawing people outdoors and increasing activity, also created challenges. Small, poorly ventilated rooms became stifling during hot days. The combination of heat, crowding, and limited water for cooling made comfort difficult. Workers adapted by adjusting schedules, working more during cooler evening hours. Major summer festivals provided entertainment for masses while creating opportunities for women in the profession. The Ludi Romani, games held in September, drew enormous crowds to Rome. These festival days, featuring chariot races, theatrical performances and public spectacles, created festive atmospheres and increased demand for all forms of entertainment and hospitality. Fall brought transitions as weather cooled and agricultural harvest occupied rural populations. Activity levels in cities shifted but remained relatively strong through early fall. The harvest festivals and associated celebrations provided occasions for business as people marked the year's agricultural success. The change of seasons required practical adjustments. As temperatures dropped, the need for warmer clothing and methods of heating small rooms created additional expenses. Oil lamps burned longer as days shortened, increasing fuel costs. These seasonal transitions required financial planning to manage increased costs while income levels shifted. Winter represented the most challenging season for the profession. Cold weather reduced street traffic. Shorter days meant fewer working hours. Travellers avoided roads during winter months. Military campaigns ceased. All these factors combined to significantly reduce business during winter months. The December Saturnalia, the year's most important festival, created complex situations. This week-long celebration involved role reversals, gift-giving, and general festivities. Normal business patterns disrupted as society engaged in festival activities. Some women in the profession saw increased business from celebrating crowds. Others found themselves unable to work as establishments closed for the holiday. The winter solstice and New Year celebrations provided occasional busy periods within otherwise slow winter months. These observances, marking the year's turning and promising spring's eventual return, involved celebrations that generated some demand for services. The very coldest months, January and February, represented the year's slowest period. Women who hadn't saved from busier seasons faced genuine hardship. The combination of reduced income, increased heating and clothing costs, and the general difficulty of winter survival created annual crises for many workers. Religious observances throughout the year created varying impacts. Some festivals prohibited certain activities, requiring establishments to close. Others encouraged celebration and entertainment, increasing business. The religious calendar's complexity required attention to know which festivals offered opportunities and which demanded closures. The cycle of games and spectacles throughout the year provided structure to urban activity patterns. Major gladiatorial games, theatrical performances and chariot racing events drew crowds from surrounding regions. These events, occurring according to established schedules, allowed some planning around anticipated busy periods. Personal festivals, particularly birthdays and anniversaries, created individual occasions when clients might seek celebration. Wealthy clients celebrating personal milestones sometimes included lavish private entertainment. These individual celebrations, scattered throughout the year, provided irregular but welcome income. The annual cycle of military movements affected cities differently based on location. Rome saw soldiers passing through during campaign seasons. Frontier cities experienced seasonal influxes as military activities increased during fighting months. Port cities saw naval activity peak during sailing season. The contrast between peak and slow seasons required financial management to survive annual cycles. Women needed to save during busy months to sustain themselves during slow periods. Failure to plan for seasonal variations could lead to crisis during winter months when income dropped while expenses increased. The festival calendar also created psychological rhythms. Major festivals provided breaks in routine, opportunities for celebration, and markers of time's passage. These cultural touchstones helped structure yearly experience and provided moments of joy, or at least respite, from daily difficulties. The agricultural calendar's influence extended to cities through food availability and pricing. Harvest times meant abundant food at lower prices. Late winter and early spring, before new harvests, saw food scarcity and higher prices. These patterns affected daily life as everyone's purchasing power varied with seasonal food costs. As this detailed exploration concludes, the complexity of these women's daily lives in ancient Rome emerges clearly. They were human beings navigating constrained choices, difficult circumstances, and a society that simultaneously depended upon and rejected them. The economic realities they faced involved constant balancing of income and expenses, with most living paycheck to paycheck while attempting to save for uncertain futures. The few who achieved relative prosperity did so through combination of fortune, skill, and careful management. The majority survived at subsistence or near subsistence levels, forever vulnerable to catastrophes that could destroy their fragile stability. The social stigma attached to their profession shaped every interaction, creating isolation even while living among crowds. The legal disabilities marked them as different, permanently consigning them to Roman society's margins regardless of personal qualities or achievements. The clothing requirements visibly identified them, ensuring that stigma followed everywhere. The health challenges, both physical and psychological, created ongoing burdens. Occupational risks, limited medical care, and the stresses of difficult lives took cumulative tolls. Women who survived into old age often carried the physical marks of hard years and chronic conditions that ancient medicine couldn't effectively treat. The personal relationships they formed provided essential emotional sustenance. Friendships, romantic partnerships, family connections when they existed, and bonds with children all created webs of human connection that made life bearable. These relationships, however complicated by professional circumstances, represented the humanity that persisted despite everything. The religious and spiritual dimensions of their lives provided meaning and hope. Prayers to Venus, participation in festivals when possible, and maintenance of household shrines connected them to divine forces and to Roman religious culture broadly. Their exclusion from certain religious observances hurt but didn't eliminate their spiritual lives. The practical knowledge and survival strategies they developed demonstrated resilience and intelligence. These women weren't passive victims but active agents navigating difficult circumstances with whatever resources they possessed. Their strategies, while not always successful, represented ongoing efforts to improve their situations and maintain dignity. The diversity of experiences within the profession reminds us that generalization obscures important variations. Elite workers, middle-level workers, and those in desperate circumstances lived very different daily lives despite sharing a profession. Enslaved and free workers faced different constraints and possibilities. Age, health, location, and numerous other factors created unique individual experiences within general patterns. The legacy of these women extends beyond their individual lives. They were part of Roman urban life, contributing to economies, engaging with communities, and participating in cultural practices. Their experiences illuminate broader patterns of marginalization, economic exploitation, gender dynamics, and survival strategies relevant across historical periods. The historical study of their lives requires careful methodology, critical source analysis, and acknowledgement of evidentiary limitations. The sources that survive, biased and incomplete, provide windows into past realities but require sophisticated interpretation. Archaeological evidence complements textual sources, providing material grounding for historical reconstruction. The contemporary relevance of this historical topic lies not in simplistic comparisons between ancient and modern, but in understanding how human societies have addressed persistent challenges around intimate commerce, economic marginalization, social stigma, and vulnerable populations. History provides context for ongoing discussions without prescribing answers. The human stories behind the historical abstractions matter most. These were women who laughed and cried, hoped and feared, succeeded and failed, loved and lost. They experienced the full range of human emotion despite their profession and social position. Their humanity transcended their circumstances, even when society refused to acknowledge it. Thank you for engaging with this complex historical topic. May this exploration contribute to understanding of ancient Roman society, of women's experiences in difficult circumstances, and of the ongoing human challenges of survival, dignity, and community across all historical periods. Until next time, rest well.